Thank you, Till. Thank you, everybody, for the attendance, but also for the invitation. Thank you, Philippe, for the organization. So yes, I'm a historian of science. Thank you, Till. I am not a medievalist yet. I studied a lot medieval history in relation with my history of science PhD. So today, yes, I want to address a question which is kind of a fearsome question about cumulativity. I'm sure it will raise discussions because I think it's a huge issue which is kind of difficult to address. So just to very briefly, I am interested in doing history of digital history and in trying to consider how digital changed our relationship with historical sources and also the historian craft. So today, the idea is that I will try to address this, let's say, briefly, the fact that medievalists are not considered to have moved toward digital by specialists in the field. And the availability of huge corpus of digitized sources has, in a way, not changed the practices of medievalists, and the fact that despite the mass of documents available, there has been no paradigmatic shift. I want to argue that this is in fact not that true if first we stop considering moving to digital as moving to quantitative methods, and also if we look at how practices of corpuses change in relation with the fact that we have new edition practices, that the availability of new collection of sources and new access to sources change the craft of the historians, and if we consider the ways in which medievalists saw the epistemological function of corpuses change within their research. So this is a very brief summary of the talk. The structure is the following. I will introduce the dreams and disillusion about cumulativity in medieval history in the 60s, from the 60s to the late 90s. I will, after that, show a few practices and modelization of historical sources in the 60s and 70s. I will then try to provide some paths towards the study of the transmission of practices of corpuses from one corpus or one research collective to another. And I will try to briefly conclude after that. So in the late 50s, archivists and medievalists in Europe and in the US have glimpsed the possibilities the electronic computers offers to renew the access to their sources. They have launched ambitious projects in the 60s that aim at producing new types of research instruments, such as databanks, automatic indexes, computational concordances, etc. A few examples being the Library of Latin Text, which started at the CT-Doc in Louvain, the ARTEM Charter database, which started in Nancy, around Lucie Fossier, Michel Paris, and Marion Créange, or more personal, let's say, projects such as the Orvieto Cadastral Study, which was conducted by Elisabeth Carpentier. I consider three important epistemological dimensions of these developments to be the addition of sources which were considered incomplete or inaccurate and even false to a certain extent by these medievalists. So in their eyes, it precluded medieval history to produce cumulative historical knowledge, and they had the idea that digital scholarly instruments would help in achieving such an ambition. One of these medievalists was David Early. So he was a medievalist from the Brown University. And in 1966, he launched one of the first digital history projects together with Christian Klapisch, which is now well known as the 1427 Catasto database. And he stated in a letter addressed to Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie at the beginning of the project that the project I have been working on is to prepare an edition of the Catasto for the computer. This edition, once made, could be cheaply reproduced and utilized by scholars in any part of the world. They could, in other words, program the data in any way they wanted, according to their own research goals. Eventually, it seems to me many such great statistical sources are to be edited for the computer, so that entire libraries of such data could be accumulated. This project would be an initial step in achieving such a goal and would convey invaluable experience as to what should be included in such computer editions. So there you can see that Early emphasized the hope of permanent and programmable digital scholarly instruments as soon as 1966, and the dream of constituting huge libraries of such types by editing digital sources in the form of databases. This is from, let's say that this idea came from the social sciences, and especially the Inter-University Consortium for Political Research, which was implemented in Wisconsin at the same time, which was a kind of library of databases for political sciences. The same type of dreams was carried out by Leopold Génicot, a Belgian medievalist, in the conclusion of one of the first major conference on computer science and medieval history in Rome in 1975, where he said that one of the position, and I will not read all the quote because I have a lot of quote in the talk, but he stated that an initial position in order to address the issue of the role assigned to computers in the historical studies would be to prepare and facilitate to put data onto materials, tape or disk that should prepare and facilitate all research without distinction. This includes research in disciplines parallel or related to our own, such as philology. And it stated that they should include research that we don't think of today, but which will one day be brought to light by progress in the field. And there, just as with Early, you can see that the question of cumulativity is considered in a progressive manner by producing permanent edition or edition that would aim at enhancing all types of research and even issues that have not been even imagined yet. So you can find other type of statements like that in the 1960s and 1970s, but 20 years later, the picture is quite different, and here is just a quote by Alain Ruggiero, who is a contemporary historians. So at a roundtable in Nice, in a colloquium dedicated to history and computer science, he said that we urgently need to raise the issue of cumulative knowledge and the reuse of historian scientific material, which, it's true, in most cases is not reusable. Information technology gives us hope of being able to reuse material developed by colleagues, but there is still too much reticence in people's mind. After many hopes pinned on IT tools by the historian community, we've reached the time of disappointment. So you can see that 20 years later, the situation is quite different. And he provides there a first explanation for that, which is that the material is not reusable and that there is a reticence in his colleagues' minds. So other explanation for the absence of cumulative knowledge has been discussed since, and notably one by Manfred Thaler in a paper from 1995. I will not read the full quote, but the idea is the following. A huge majority of historians followed the advice of using computers to apply quantitative methods. However, this was not their aim at the beginning, and I will read the second part of the of the quote. The fact that today the majority of computer-using historians, as opposed to the 70s, are not quantifiers, sometimes even emphatically non-quantifiers, is not the result of a devious conspiracy of source-oriented methodology, seducing the innocent historical community away from just statistics into the sensual embrace of non-quantitative argumentation. That embrace simply is what a huge majority of them wanted from the beginning. So there, Thaler considered the evolution of the rationale behind the uses of computer in terms of the application of statistics. A similar approach or explanation of the situation was given by Nicolas Perrault in 2014, so at least 20 years after. And the idea was that the use of quantitative methods, or the interest in quantitative methods in medieval history, was occasional, and that databases were only used as simple data mine. In his wishes, he would have wished that the exploitation of these vast corpuses, and he used the word corpuses, would have been better if considered as one big corpus. And this is what he stated at the beginning of the quote. So in his eyes, the conclusion is therefore simple. There is a significant gap between the creation of databases, an activity in which medievalists excel, and this is a good thing, and their exploitation. So this raises a fearsome question about cumulativity in digital history, which is to what extent has the use of computers been an agent of the cumulativity of the historical knowledge since the early 1960s? And this is the title I chose, is Cumulativity of Knowledge an Epistemological Chimera. So the common idea is that we should address this issue by looking at the application of quantitative or computational methods to the reuses of digital scholarly instruments. I propose today another approach, which is to consider what is transmitted from a generation to another, or from a research collective to another. And these are new corpuses of what I will label as new sources because of their new forms or new formats, digital or digitized editions, facsimile, photo, databases. This is also new ways to access and analyze these corpuses, search engines, statistical tools, word processing, Zoom, etc. And there is, last but not least, new theoretical approaches to corpuses. So I propose to focus on data reuses and corpus practices to appreciate the cumulativity of historical knowledge in the second part of the 20th century. Their corpus practices refers to the way in which historians assemble documents with the aim to address specific issues in given historiographical and material context. And this raises questions such as how are documents or texts put together with the aim to produce knowledge, according to what logic, homogeneity, heterogeneity, a single source, several, etc., with what research objectives in mind, what elements of text or documents are considered to be of interest and are therefore included in the corpus, and how do answers to these questions evolve over time, according, for example, to historiographical agendas, to geographical context, or to the equipment historians have at their disposal. So this idea has been brought to my mind reading Eliana Magnani, who is a medievalist from the LAMOP in Paris. So in 2016, they organized a roundtable called "What is a Corpus?" And in the presentation of the roundtable, Eliana stated that since the 1980s, but especially the 2000s, the use of the word corpus by medievalists has become widespread without being accompanied by any reflection on what lies behind the term, let alone any efforts at conceptualization. Coinciding with computerization and the upsurge in digitization and databases of medieval documents, this situation contrasts with other disciplines in the human and social sciences, starting with linguistics, which have long been reflecting on and debating this notion. And she identified two distinct origins of the term corpus. The first is from law, as in corpus juris, and is a Roman law collection and is rather loose. And the other one is from linguistics, and especially from the German corpus, and is defined as a set of texts established according to a thematic criterion with a view to their linguistic study. Magnani also studied 127 articles by medievalists in this paper, and she identifies that there is rather loose use of the first type, that is as a collection of texts, far from the constructed and delimited characters that exist among linguists. And I think that the 1960s and 1970s are a privileged period in the history of corpus practices because of two combined elements. First, it's a moment of huge interdisciplinarity trade between notably quantitative history, linguistics, demography, sociology, and anthropology. This is also the moment when there is an automation or computerization of these disciplines. And this is, for the historian of history, an important moment, as it provokes what François Furet has called a passage de l'implicite à l'explicite, a path from the implicit to the explicit, due to the fact that computer requires to formalize reasoning precisely. For the historian of history, it is also a chance, let's say, to have documents where these reasoning are formalized and explicitly expressed. So we can access to the workshop of the historians. So two questions I will try to answer. The first one is, what were the practices of corpuses developed by early digital medievalists in the 1960s and 1970s? And how did they implement these practices in the research instruments they produced? And I will consider two dimensions of the latter, two, let's say, levels of granularity. The first one is, how did the medievalists define their corpus? How did they choose the documents or texts which they include in the corpus? And what is the epistemological function of the approach they chose? And the second level is, how did medievalists select information from the sources? And what are the effects of the latter on the reuses of the data? And I will present two case studies. The first one, I will label it as a single source approach. It is, you will see a kind of statistical addition in the form of a database. So this is the Catasto of 1427 I already mentioned. It is strongly related to demography. And the second case study is on multi-source approach, a full text edition in the model of bag of words, let's say, and is strongly related to quantitative linguistics and especially to lexicometry. So the first case study is one I conducted during my PhD, is the one of the edition for the computer, and I quote, of the Florentine Catasto of 1427, which was conducted between 1966 and 1978, and which is of interest, as I just said, because it is a single source corpus approach, and because it is a way of editing which was embodied in demographic and social sciences standards. So the Florentine Catasto is a kind of census resulting from the tax law. It is a monument of late medieval history because it gathered together more than 6,000 unwritten declarations in 3 layers: the Portate, the Campioni, and the Sommario, which were all in various archive founds in Tuscany. And it contained, and this is what interested David Early and Christian Klapisch, the two medievalists who conducted the survey and the edition of the database. it contained economic and demographic information about more than 264,000 people. That is all the inhabitants of Florence and even the poorest, as well as the animals. So this is the same quote as earlier, just to say that the idea was to produce both a collective or documentary scholarly instrument, which might be reused by other historians in any part of the world. But it was also a database that would be used by David Early and Christian Klapisch to perform a survey on demographical and economical aspects of the Florentine administration and the Florentine taxpayers. First things first, we have to emphasize on the material context in which this study took place and on the heavy material context, which was the one of computer science in the late 1960s. So here is an IBM 36085. This is what we call the mainframe computer. So they were installed in computer centers, usually for the academic world, in universities or inter-university computing centers. And the novelty of this type of computer is that the computer power increased by almost 100, and that it make available an internal memory so as to store provisory results of computation. So this definition encompasses different type of machine, but in the case of David Early and Christian Klapisch, they use an IBM 36085, just as in the picture. And what is important is that it was used in batch mode, that is which implies slow operation, the need for operators, and a very poor interactivity. And at the core of these practices were punch cards. So you might have seen some images of punch cards. These were used for both entering data into the machine and for entering software as well. And they were produced using a punching machine, which is this. And I will come back to this in a minute. So in order to produce this database on more than 264,000 people in a computer center, the Christian Klapisch and David Early gathered an interdisciplinary team. So first, it was an international collaboration between France, the USA, and Italy, but several institutions were also engaged. So at the EHESS, the History Lab, the CRH, at the University of Wisconsin, the Department of History, but also a cartography lab of the EHESS, a mechanography lab, a punching card private companies, and computing centers. And so within the team, there was historians leading the project, computer scientists, petite main, let's say, workforce, which were basically advanced students or PhD students. There was also photographers, which took photo of the materials in Florence and in Tuscany and sent microfilms to the US and to Paris. There was also cartographers and, important for our matter, demographers in the name of Jacques Dupaty and Louis Henry. Both were important figures in formalizing formalizing early historical demography. And they were also considered deemed specialists of data formalization, and so a kind of caution for from the social science to historians. So what is a computer edition in this case? And this is important for us because you'll see that it implies a lot of decision so as to produce the edition, and so it also implies specific approach to corpus and limitation in future reuses. So in this case, and this is the definition by Early, the computer edition is the data once punched will be read onto tape, and this will be the final form of the edition. And this implied that there was 4 steps of remediation. The first were from the unwritten declaration, so from the sources itself, to microfilms. Then from microfilms to coding sheets, and I will show you a coding sheet in a minute. And then from coding sheets to punch card, and finally, the punch card were recorded onto magnetic tape within the walls of the computing center. This implies also the definition of a code, as you might know, and in this case, the collaboration with demographers was very important because it shaped the way in which the code was produced, and most importantly, the implication of demographer affected the data that will be recorded. Christian Clapiche put it in a letter in 1967. Louis Henry, so the demographer, was very insistent that we should attempt a study of family composition using data on kinship relationships. And this led to the definition of no more than 7 columns dedicated to demographical data. So this is the last paragraph, which starts with colon 915, etc. So the form of the edition was the following. So this is a coding sheet, and the idea is that each pair of lines consists in 80 columns, which is the 80 columns of the punch card. So for each declaration, they produced 2 punch cards. The first one was considered the socio-economical punch card with the socio-economical information about the chief of the household. And there you have his name, his family name, some information about his tax, etc. And the second card was the so-called demographical card with demographical data such as the genre, the age, the marital status, the code of kinship relationship for each people within the household. So this is of interest because, as you will see, this implies some limitation in the way in which the source is modelized. So in this case, they should have, for example, inscribed the declaration, which were unwritten declaration in full text, but they decided to go that way for various reasons, but mainly because of the size of the corpus they had in mind, but also because of the rationale behind their study, which was to combine or to analyze together demographical and socio-economical data. So this was to show you the, let's say, the material and statistical requirements of such a study. What is interesting for us is the fact that they approach the source as a single source corpus. So what I have in mind here is that they decided, because of epistemological reasons and because of the functions they attribute to the corpus, that they will consider the Catasto and only the Catasto. And this rise in the archives as follows. So in a letter from Clapiche-Joubert to Early, she asked him what should the historian do, for example, if he detects, using another source, an error in the information gathered by the city scribes. Should he correct the error or retain it to remain faithful to the source at the risk of disturbing the demography? And Early responded, "We are interested only in the Catasto, and we don't want to violate its integrity. That is, if both Portate and Campioni list a man as 60 years old, and you know that he is really 63, he should be entered as 60. Even error can be revealing." And there you see that there is a specific approach to the corpus, which is different from what the demographer might have advised. On the contrary, for example, for the demographers, they say that recording wrong ages will risk disturbing the demography. They also stated that the poor quality of age recording by the Florence scribes constitute a permanent handicap in demographic analysis. And finally, they proposed to use statistical method to understand whether the information contained in the source reflect the demographic reality or constitute a distortion of the latter, linked to, for example, a phenomenon such as under-recording or fraud. And in fact, the choice made by Early and Clapiche-Joubert was applauded by peers in the historical disciplines, because finally they decided to edit the age without correction, so using only the source of the Catasto as a source. And in doing so, they identified and recorded numerous errors of this type in the data extracted from the Catasto. On this basis, they identified a socially situated practice of age rounding in 15th century Florence, and they finally dedicated an entire chapter of their 1978 book to this issue. Age rounding, therefore, appears to be positively correlated with age and negatively correlated with wealth. And this was applauded by peers, and notably by Jean-Philippe Genet, another historian, medievalist specialized in digital applications. And he stated that the superficial historians would once again have concluded the impossibility of statistics from medieval sources, but through meticulous observation, we penetrate medieval man's attitude to numbers. And I think this short sequence highlights an important element, which is first a friction between the practices of corpus of demographers and the one of historians. And the choice to consider only the Catasto as a source guide the analysis of the data on the one hand, but it also precludes them from making errors, let's say, in the conclusion about this age pyramid they had to construct. However, this also had some effects on the reception. And this is another element of the question of cumulativity and the importance of these practices of corpuses, which is about the circulation of the Catasto database and the reuses. The first thing is that in order to compare this source, which was edited as a single source, the idea was to produce similar databases to constitute, as you remember, a library of computer edition. But in fact, there was no library of such databases in medieval history. The code of the 1427 Catasto was reused by Anthony Mollo, a student of David Early, for the 1481 Catasto. But this databases was, to my knowledge, never published. However, the database of the 1427 Catasto is still available. So you have an online Catasto hosted by the Brown University Library, and you have also an Excel document and a CSV file, which is provided by the UHSS. However, And despite the fact that, and this is quite rare, despite the fact that there was preservation over the long term of the database, I was unable to identify any reuses of the database as a whole in other projects. And this is, in my opinion, due to two elements. The first one is the way in which it was edited, as I just showed you, like in editing it as a combination of socio-economic and demographical information. It in a way preclude from studying other aspects. And in fact, Christian Klapisch and David Early already exhaust this study. And this was also a regret from Christian Klapisch, who was who would have been interested in studying the anthroponymy and the first names. So this is the first element, and the second element is this single source approach, which in a way preclude from reusing the data by let's say combine it with other databases of other types. So the conclusion is that the way in which the corpus was considered and the way in which it was edited, in fact, precluded from further reuses, but not for citation. And there was a lot of reuses of the published results of tables, of graphs and elements like that. And it does not preclude the study, the survey, to be considered a milestone in historical demography and to be cited by more than 1,000 references, for example, in Google Scholars. So this was the first case study. Just 1 minute. So this was for the first case study. The second one is about political mentalities. And I will, just as I did, consider two elements, two level of granularity, the edition itself and the way in which texts are chosen to be gathered or put together in a corpus. So this project originated from a small team from the Parisien Sorbonne, specialized in political history of the late Middle Ages, a team which was supervised by Bernard Guenet and composed of François Autran, Colette Beaune, Jean-Philippe Genet, Claude Govard, Hélène Millet, et Alain Desmurger. And in the annual report of the CNRS in 1981, they stated that in order to allow the historians to make the most of literary sources, which are crucial for the specialists in political history, to bring the history of ideas out of the realm of subjective impressions and pointillist analysis, where it has been confined for too long, and to bring it into the realm of rigorous quantitative research through the study of the privileged medium of the text, it seems necessary to us to construct a program specifically intended for the historians. And within this team, there are two parallel projects. The first was the constitution of this program, which will be called Aline, and the editions of text onto punch card, which will be called MEDITEXT. So basically, Aline was a language processing software. It was very limited. It was done with very limited human and financial resources. And it has three goals. First, to provide researchers interested in processing vernacular text with a program well adapted to the characteristics of medieval text, and notably the issue of vocabulary and instability of vocabulary, of orthographs, sorry. Because the CTDoc and the RHT have already one software, but for Latin text. It was also to create a program which will be economical as possible in its utilization, and to present a simple and easy to use working tool that does not require the use of a programmer or even an operator. And there you can see the shift with the first project, which is a few years before. The idea is to try to be more independent from the computer centers. And in order to use, so this program was to be applied to MEDITEXT, a cartothèque, corpus of a text, collection of text inscribed on punch card of 40 texts in different languages, Middle French, Middle English, and Latin. And in 1984, this was one of the biggest library of such type in medieval history in Europe. So this is an example of an output document concordance from the ALIN program. But what I will be interested in is first the way in which it considers the edition of the text. And so the level of granularity I told you about, which is the level of the element you took from the text. And we will see that it's rather different from the approach of David Early and Christian Klapisch from the first case study. So the specific feature of Genet, by contrast with the Catasto, was the fact that they did not use coding sheets and they go straight to punching. And this implies that the punching was done by medievalists specialized of the ancient and vernacular languages of the sources. And this was mainly because of economical and material reasons. So this preclude from the development or from recording huge text and a lot of text. And this is why MEDITEXT stay at 40 texts, because they did not have the material and economical means to achieve, to produce a huger corpus. There was also the fact that there was almost no coding. And the idea was to consider that the model of the text was chain of characters. And so you have just sequence of characters, just as strings. This is what we call strings today. So the texts are modelized in a specific way, and that operation eliminates several aspects of the text: the diagrammatical structure, which is the way in which the text is composed, columns, paragraph, etc. Paleographical aspects were also delayed and also genetical aspects, as well as philological aspects, because all the variation and the variants are disappeared from the text. This is important because it shows that this type of edition are designed to treat some specific questions and not the others. There was nonetheless other methods for editing text at the era 713 with part of text, grammatical function, annotation, etc. Well, this is one element that explains that that shows the relation between a will to produce specific, will to conduct a specific type of study, and this is lexical statistics, with the way in which you edit the text. And this is also why this scholarly instruments, or in this case, this collection of digitized text, are not fit to be reused outside their context of production. In the case you don't want to perform the same type of analysis. The other question is is related to the constitution of the corpus of work by Genet himself. So Jean-Philippe Genet is one of the main users and producer of ALIN and of MEDITEXT, and he was interested in political history and in trying to produce and to constitute his corpus. And because of all these material requirements and the heaviness of the punching operation and the addition of text, he had to choose carefully the text he will be interested in. And so here he states the approach he he undertook. So we are going to look for the fields or fields. So this is the notion by Pierre Bourdieu, the notion of champ, where social and political ideas are recognized or recognizable as such. Once we have recognized them, we will observe the text, since it is a mosaic that will enable us to perceive the field and the agents, the author or assimilated, but also the recipients. Finally, it will be possible to undertake the lexical study once the text have been structured into a corpus. And so there you see that there is an important shift, or this is at least what I observe in my own corpus. There is a shift in considering the corpus as something you structure in order to undertake a specific type of approach, which is the lexical study. And what we can see is that the rationale behind the corpus constitution in this study is to constitute three diachronic corpuses, which bring together so-called literary texts of different kinds, which are considered by Genet as political texts, so mirror to princes, speeches, letters, sermons, and which are grouped according to first their languages. So there was two corpus in English and one in French, and vernacular and Latin. They are then grouped according to the subject, and here I quote a sufficiently recognizable subject, for example, political theory, and what Genet called their character, so theoretical or practical, and this is this is important categories in his in his analysis framework. And so the aim is to study of pure lexicography and everything that favors text-to-text comparison. So the workflow is basically the following. You are constructing corpuses, so English versus French, of the same subject, or of theoretical versus practical, and you conduct lexical analysis in order to produce frequencies indicators to compare between theoretical and practical vocabulary. So this is a corpus-driven, lexicon-based approach, but with the text as the basic units. And there is two levels of comparison in this case, within a corpus that is between different texts, and between different corpus that is between the theoretical and the practical corpuses. So this very articulated approach to corpus is originated from two different elements. The first one is a consideration about the methods of other specialists in political history, and there he mentioned Quentin Skinner and said the following. Classical political texts are, for the most part, known to each other and cited as authorities. It is all too easy for historians of ideas to take each idea extracted from carefully selected texts through a process of refinement in which the culture and personal preoccupation of the historians of ideas himself play a decisive role, and perch it above the previous one, thus building a scaffolding of political ideas toward a summit or culmination. And so here he chose to consider corpus as a linguist, following, so this is the second element that led him to construct this this vision or this approach or this epistemological function of corpus in his case, is that he wanted to separate from the approach of the history of idea, which he just described, and by using the very formalized approach of corpus in linguistics, and especially in discourse analysis and lexicometry. So to conclude, in the 1970s, there is this encounter between the corpus practices of linguists and historians, and the case of Genet is quite revealing, which is articulated around the circulation of quantitative methods. And so Genet is applying through this Aline software lexicometry and quantitative lexical analysis of vocabulary. And so in doing so, he's thinking and is implementing the practices of corpuses. So there you can see that there is a kind of trade between the two. And so the evolution in the conception of the corpus, which becomes in this case, if not an instrument of measurement, at least a tool for controlling the interpretative path, is related, in fact, to the use of computer and is an important shift, and show how it can evolve, how these corpus practices evolve in relation to the use of computer and in relation to these interdisciplinary connections. So 3 things about this informatico-statistical linguistic context. The corpus conditions the questions it is used to answer. It acts as a formalizing factor, or at least a means of making comparison operation explicit. And it is also, as I stated before, a product of material operation. Okay. So very briefly, I want to address another dimension of this issue of cumulativity, which is how did corpus practices were transmitted, were not implemented in a given scholarly instruments by the producer of this instrument, but how did corpus practices were transmitted from one instrument to another, or from, let's say, one collective of producer to another. And I will be very brief, as I have just a few minutes to finish. So I want to take the case of the ARTEM, which was a database which was launched in 1966. First, the project was launched in 1966 in Nancy. So it was first from the CRAL and then the ARTEM. Now it's more or less 5,000 original diplomatic documents. So this is in diplomatics. And it was first limited to documents to Eastern France and extended to... So I will pass briefly on the intention of the producers, but the idea is that the idea was to edit and publish data in the form of indexes, which were not produced for one specific use. And it has been made available in various forms in the 70s. And what I found interesting is that you can see in diplomatics that there is some different, let's say, a kind of potential genealogy following this first important project in France, one of which is corpus known as the Corpus Burgundiae Medievi. And the situation is the following. So it was launched in 2004 at the conjunction of 2 events. So one is the beginning of a project, a national project conducted by Benoît Michel Toc called Charte et Pouvoir. And the other one is the fact that the engineer of the ARTEM, so the producer of this database of diplomatic documents, was arriving in Dijon, where Eliana Magnani, one of the key scholar in the development of the CMBA, the Corpus Burgundiae Medievi, was working in connection with Benoît Michel Toc. And in fact, if you look at the curriculum of these three researchers, you can see that Benoît Michel Toc was in fact a student of Paul Tombeur, so one of the pioneer of digital edition of Diplomatic Act in Louvain. And so there is, just like that, a kind of genealogy of scholars to explore. And this is one thing I'm trying to do right now in conducting various interviews. And what I am also interested in is what did they bring from one collective to another besides their expertise and, let's say, network. And what is interesting is that we saw that they bring with them, and this is what Marie-Josée Gaz-Grandjean brought with her in Dijon, codebook and ideas on how to modelize texts, and that in doing so, there is some practices of modelization which are transferred from one collective to another. Another thing that was transferred, and I am still in the process of analyzing this circulation, is a software called Idealist, which was the query system in Nancy at the ARTEM, and which then became the query system of the CMBA for at least the beginning of the period. So this is one element of importance to look at, and if you want to show to see what is transmitted from one to another, from one collective to another. Another element is the fact that there is also accumulation in the already published charters and printed edition of charters and deeds, which are, in the case of the CMBA, used, digitized, and made available in PDF, which is another important element of the accumulation of data, because in many cases it is in fact on the basis of edition that the database are constructed and that the computational approach are developed. But this is rather common knowledge. Another element of interest is that this quote by Eliana, but I'm gonna go very fast on this, and she highlights, in fact, that one of her PhD students adapted the database, the actual database, and the actual metadata of the charters to other type of documents, to other type of source, and especially to Lives of Saints, by implementing also new fields and taking into account the particularities of this documentary typology. So you can see that there is also a logic of feeding the corpus with new text and trying to adapt the metadata. So in a way, I have still to do further study on this, but in a way you can imagine that there is a lineage between the data created at the ARTEM in the 1960s to actual documents in the CMBA, which are not even charters anymore. And there is this kind of long story to do in the coding of medieval documents with the case of this lineage. But another important thing is to consider the various form of uses of these documents. And there I will go very briefly on the fact that there are a lot of computational uses, and the one by Nicolas Perrault are of great interest, as he gathered together a lot of digital documents, digital charters, which were produced and edited by the CMBA, but also by the ARTEM, also by the project of Benoît Michel Toc, also by the DITS project, to create this kind of vast mega corpus, meta corpus, of more than 2 billions of words and lots of thousands of documents. But what I am interested in is to consider also the fact that there is a lot of different users. There are not just the user that use these big amounts and big data, big corpuses of data. There is also a lot of different users. And if you have a look at the statistics from the CMBA website, you can see that there is around 150 visits per month, which are basically short times. But that there is also a lot of downloads. And so within the CMBA, you can download text, point text, TXT version, you can download PDF, and you can download corpuses. And this is an interesting element to look at. And I think it is important to consider the effects of these rather traditional methods or low-level uses on the new access to documents, and on the way in which corpus are constructed and are put, and documents and text are put together. And I think this is an element which is not really considered right now. And this is what I want to emphasize. Have a look at this kind of invisible gestures. And this is what Muller and Claver have done in a recent book called Le goût de l'archivaire numérique. I'm going to stop there just by concluding briefly that I think that there is a lot of obstacles in reusing all scholarly instruments, and almost and also new ones, technical, editorial issues, theoretical choices which are implemented, as I have just stated. But we can see that there is also a lot of cumulative elements, reuses of old edition to produce digital scholarly instruments, reuses of old working documents, some things that pass from people to people. And I think that what is important would be to consider the diversity of cultures regarding corpus practices in our disciplines. And to do so, we need, I think, to conduct research towards the actual invisible uses of digital scholarly instruments, such as the one I just mentioned. Thank you.